So once you've found the customer that you want to update, scroll down to the customer sites and go to the site in question. So here we already have a customer set up. Once you're in the site, you have several tabs for the site information, but except for the address, which of course the actual country of the address is used for the tax itself. The only other tab you need to be concerned about is the tax profile. So if you click on that one, once we're in the tax profile tab, we have the ability to put the right information. Generally, you don't have to set anything here, but if you do, then for customers, you want to set the rounding to the line level, and for the rounding level, usually it's set to nearest. Then we can go on to the tax registrations. So with the tax registrations, it's very, very simple. If you've got a VAT number or GST number, for example, put in the country code, and then you can put in the VAT registration number. So you can see here I've just put in a random number, and you can say that this is actually VAT for the registration type. If I then save that particular transaction, you'll notice that we get an error, and this is because the format here for the particular VAT registration number we put in is actually validated, and therefore you can't just put in a random VAT registration number. So because you can't use a made up VAT registration number, you actually have to put in a correct value. And if you've got any spaces, so for example here, if I save this one, we're going to get the same error. So let's change that particular number, or change that particular VAT registration number here, and now we can click on save, and it should be validated and accepted. Now that's all you need to do for a tax classification code if your customer is actually registered for tax. If the country is outside of Europe, then generally there's no requirement to put in a tax registration number here. Obviously, if the customer does have one for that particular country, then you can put it in. However, if your customer was not registered for VAT, so by default we assume everyone is registered for tax. So if your customer was not registered for VAT, then you wouldn't have any of this information. So this would be blank, and we'd actually have to put a tax registration in here. So click on the create button, and then we can choose the registration. Now you can only choose VAT registration numbers that actually exist. So choose your VAT regime code. You need to choose the tax as well. The reason for that is the tax is actually where the validation to allow duplicate tax registration numbers is set. So if you don't choose a tax and the VAT registration number has been used elsewhere, then you're likely to have a problem. Tax point basis doesn't have to be filled out because there is a default, but generally it is invoice if you want to put that value in. We definitely do not need any jurisdictional information, so don't put anything in jurisdictions. Registration type is VAT. This information here, corporate reporting name, legal registration address, is not essential. If you have that information, you can put it in. So there is no VAT registration number here. We come over to the tax registration status, and for the tax registration status, we go down to not registered. We click on the not registered, set the start date to a date in the past, otherwise any invoices that you may create with a previous invoice date wouldn't actually pick up this information. And then save. And you can see here now that we actually have the VAT registration code. It doesn't actually say that they're not registered, but the fact that you don't have a registration number could be that an indicator. And if you want to have a look at this one, of course, you can just click on the edit on the number here, and you can see the information. The other tabs, so aside from the tax registration, we have tax exemptions. We don't use this. So tax exemptions are not used in our solution. Tax classifications. This isn't something that's mandatory, but you may have customers that have an exemption, or potentially they're actually offshore. What I mean by offshore is that you could have a location that's an oil rig or a ship, and therefore the ship to location of your sale could actually be to a port, and therefore the port is in your local country. The tax logic would look at the ship to location and say, that's in the UK, so therefore calculate UK tax. When in actual fact, the final destination, because it's going to an oil rig, it means that the final ship to is actually not in the UK. And so in this particular case, we can put a classification against it to say it's offshore. To do that, we come down to our classifications, and then in our drop-down list, you'll see that we have a couple of values. So generally, the best way of doing this is actually to look for anything with the word tax in it. So here we've got the tax parties, and we choose one for the UK. The more countries you have, the more values you'll have to choose from, and everything is country specific, and everything is shared between suppliers and customers. So there may be values that are only applicable to a customer or a supplier. We can then choose a fiscal classification. So we have two values here. The first one is exempt from VAT. By choosing this, we are classifying this particular customer for every single transaction we create for them to be exempt from VAT. This is would be useful if it's maybe some sort of government agency, or if it's a charity, for example. The other value we have here is offshore, and as I indicated previously, offshore would be that the actual site is located offshore, but for tax purposes, if we were to use the ship to location, which could be the port, it would calculate tax. So choosing offshore would actually drive an out-of-scope tax. The tax in question would be GB VAT export. So let's actually choose exempt. Put the start date in. So we can put in a date here, any date really, but realistically, put in a date which could be a date range. So for example, if someone is exempt from tax and they have an exemption certificate, make sure you put the date range of that certificate in, because if you are selling to that customer and their exemption certificate expires, you don't want to keep sending them transactions. You don't want to keep sending them invoices that have exempt tax on it, because if you were meant to charge tax and you didn't, you are actually liable for that tax if the customer decided not to subsequently pay any additional tax after the event. So make sure you get the start and the end date in there correctly. If it is a site, for example, which is always going to be offshore, then of course you can just put in any date in here. Tax reporting codes. These are not actually used, and withholding tax registration is covered in a different tutorial. So once you have that information in, we can simply save, and your customer now has been set up for the tax related information. One of the recommendations we make is that you always get the finance team to check to make sure that the correct VAT registration number has been applied before any invoices are actually sent out. The reason for that is if the customer is a European customer and they are not registered, then we should actually be charging a local tax rate, i.e. a UK tax rate in this case, and not an intra-EU supply of goods or services. So that's something that you need to do, and it's a business process. Quite often if you put a credit hold of €1, £1, something like that for all new customers, and then the tax team or the finance team can release that hold once they have checked and put the correct information in.